What happened? What's your understanding of why they ended up getting rid of a film that they funded?
So the BBC put out a very long statement, a bullshit statement, I would argue as well. Their argument was that they had this other documentary that they aired on Gaza, which became super controversial, I would argue, for unnecessary reasons. It was narrated by a child in Gaza.
The moment this interview reaches the BBC controversy, everything changes. Because now the focus isn't just on Gaza anymore, it's on why a documentary the BBC itself funded suddenly disappeared before airing. The hosts press Mehdi Hasan directly if this was a professionally produced, high-budget documentary backed by the BBC, then what exactly made them pull away from it? And Hasan immediately points to another Gaza documentary that sparked outrage simply because it was narrated by a child surviving the war. That's where this conversation becomes explosive. Hasan argues the backlash created fear inside the BBC, leading executives to freeze another documentary before audiences could even see it. And according to him, the network wasn't disputing the journalism itself. They were worried about the political firestorm surrounding Gaza coverage. Now, the debate shifts from the war itself to something even bigger: whether major media organizations are becoming too afraid to platform Palestinian stories at all.
For the past many months, the BBC has been embroiled in a controversy in which it has been refusing to air a documentary that kind of took on a life of its own inside the organization, as the journalists there have been demanding to know what happened to an investigation that the BBC had commissioned into Israel's war on medical professionals and the entire kind of medical community inside of Gaza. That controversy now resulted in the documentary being acquired by Mehdi Hasan and Zateo News for its worldwide distribution, and by Channel 4 inside the UK for its UK distribution. So Mehdi's joining us now to talk about this documentary and also the process that led up to it being censored and now being finally released last night. Mehdi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And I wanted to start just by honoring several of the medical professionals who have been killed in this genocide. If we could put up, I believe it is C3, Dropsite posted this yesterday. This is a picture from a graduation ceremony at the Faculty of Medicine in Gaza. Four of the people that you're looking at in this photo: Dr. Omar Farwana, who was the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dr. Adnan Al-Bursh, who was head of orthopedic surgery at Al-Shifa Medical Complex, Dr. Rafat Lubad, who was the head of internal medicine at Al-Shifa, and also then this week was the killing of Dr. Marwan Al-Sultan, who was the director of the Indonesian hospital and a cardiologist. So in that photo, four of them have been assassinated, several targeted at their homes, not collateral damage from attacks on fighters or caught in crossfire. But Mehdi, I want you to talk about the targeting of medical professionals, because that is what I think people don't understand, because it sounds so insane to say it out loud. That
it sounds insane to say it out loud. It's I mean, three things I think sound insane over the last 21 months, 22 months that we've normalized. One, obviously, is the deliberate killing of journalists, which a lot of journalists in the West have a lot of problem comprehending. The other is the deliberate killing of children, of course. Gunshot wounds to the head, sniper shots, not collateral damage. And of course, the third is the doctors, the killing of doctors, nurses, paramedics, the deliberate targeting and destruction of Gaza's healthcare. And that is what the premise, that was the basis of this film is. And this film, produced by award-winning filmmakers at Basement Films in the UK, made over several months, went through rigorous checks, went through the BBC editorial process for much of it, right of reply, fantastic lead reporter, Ramida Navai, award-winning war correspondent. And they put together this film, this hour-long film, based on eyewitness testimony from Palestinian doctors and survivors, as well as Dr. Adnan Al-Bursh, who you just mentioned. He's in this film, but he's since been killed in Israeli captivity, tortured and died in prison, killed in prison, as one of his colleagues says. So you've got eyewitness testimony from Palestinian doctors to what they have had to endure. We also have an Israeli medic whistleblower in the film who served at State Haman, the Israeli gulag, the prison, the black site where they've taken Palestinian detainees to be tortured, raped, killed. So it's all there, put together in the film. And you mentioned, the targeting of doctors, saying it out loud. Perhaps the most powerful moment for me in the film, and I would urge Breaking Point's viewers to go to the Zeteo Twitter feed or Zeteo Blue Sky. We actually put up a clip from the film last night, separate to the trailer, which is one of the most powerful moments in the film, from Dr. Khalid Hamouda, who is a surgeon in Gaza, now in Egypt, who was bombed in his home with his family, a family of other doctors. At first, 10 people killed. They then flee, him, his wife, his child, and they go down the street. By the way, his house is blown up, not the entire street, just his house. They then go down the street to take refuge, and a drone follows them down the street and attacks them again. And he wakes up in a hospital and sees a nurse carrying his child, his daughter, who's dead. The next morning, his wife, the mother of his child, is also dead. He's told, killed. He's the only survivor, or one of the only survivors, I believe, from that massacre. And she says, Ramina Navai, you were targeted? He says, yes. The drone came and targeted us. And this is what we heard from the World Central Kitchen folks when they were in the humanitarian convoy and they were targeted car to car to car. This is what we've heard from journalists, of course. And this is what we have to get our heads around, that the United States of America has been arming and funding a country that is systematically, this is a key word here, destroying the Gaza healthcare system.
This is the moment where the discussion completely shifts from media controversy into a direct moral accusation. Because Mehdi Hasan isn't just talking about a documentary anymore, he's arguing there's a systematic destruction of Gaza's medical infrastructure happening in plain sight. And notice how specific the examples become. He talks about doctors allegedly being tracked, targeted at their homes, followed by drones after escaping bombings, and entire medical leadership networks being wiped out. Whether viewers agree with every political conclusion or not, the emotional power of those stories is impossible to ignore. What also makes this segment powerful is the framing around knowledge and expertise. Hasan argues hospitals can eventually be rebuilt, but experienced surgeons, specialists, professors, and medical educators cannot simply be replaced overnight. That transforms the debate from war damage into a long-term destruction of a society's ability to recover. And politically, this is exactly why the documentary became radioactive. Once accusations move from collateral damage to intentional dismantling of healthcare systems, the conversation enters territory that mainstream broadcasters become extremely cautious about platforming.
Destroying doctors and medics. And the key point here, and it comes out in the film, you could rebuild hospitals in years to come. Trump can turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East and build as many hospitals as he like. You cannot rebuild that knowledge base. You cannot rebuild that human base. You cannot just get doctors back over. Gazan society, Palestine has spent years educating itself in this way, and the Israelis have deliberately targeted it.
And the BBC funded this film. The BBC then refused to air it and was giving quote-unquote bullshit reasons, according to a source who told that to The Independent. And Mehdi, you have probably a lot of insight into this process of why the BBC, which had recently aired the Louis Theroux documentary, I believe that was on BBC. Yes. What happened? What's your understanding of why they ended up getting rid of a film that they funded?
So the BBC put out a very long statement, a bullshit statement, I would argue as well. Their argument was that they had this other documentary that they aired on Gaza, which became super controversial, I would argue, for unnecessary reasons. It was narrated by a child in Gaza, surviving the war, and it turns out the child was the son of a deputy agriculture minister in the Gaza government, some technocrat, who was then labeled, of course, as just Hamas. And there was a huge furor in the UK that the BBC had put out a film for the child of a Hamas minister, even though, again, it was a well-sourced, well-made, high-production value film. The child had not decided the editorial agenda. But while they were, quote-unquote, investigating how that happened, they decided to park this film, which, as you say, they'd spent a lot of money on, spent many months making, with Basement Films, who we at Zeteo know well because they made a film for us last year called Israel's Real Extremism, which I came on the show to talk about, if memory serves me correctly then. And the fundamental argument from the BBC was, well, Basement Films went out and talked about the process while we were still trying to get everything approved. They then put out, Basement were frustrated, of course. My friend Ben DePere, who's the executive producer, former head of Channel 4 News, very respected, award-winning journalist. He went out at the Sheffield Documentary Festival and said, come on, this is ridiculous. We've got doctors in the film waiting for this film to come out. We're showing disrespect to people who risk their lives to talk to us. Sources, whistleblowers, survivors of massacres. The BBC put out a statement saying, well, if we put it out now, there will be the perception of partiality, and the BBC can't have the perception of partiality. The great irony being, of course, that their decision not to air this film that they commissioned, that ran through their checks, that is the greatest perception of partiality. It's partiality towards Israel. They have now run one Gaza doc and then pulled it. It's nowhere to be seen because apparently it was the child of a Hamas minister bullshit argument. And now they didn't even air the other Gaza documentary. And then add that to all of the rest of the coverage of the BBC's of Gaza over the last 21, 22 months, which has been abysmal, which has caused multiple internal backlashes, protests from BBC staff who are frustrated at what their broadcaster has done. This is a BBC that has been cowed, intimidated, pressured, bullied. This is a BBC. I used to work at the BBC. I used to defend the BBC when I worked in the UK from right-wing bullshit attacks. But I think I've never seen in my entire lifetime, I'm about to turn 46 years old, in my entire lifetime of watching the BBC, I've been watching the BBC since children's cartoons on a Saturday morning, and I can honestly say it's never taken a beating like this. I've never had such a depressing, disappointing view of the national broadcast in the UK that I've had since October 2023. I know many other people who've stopped watching the BBC, stopped appearing on the BBC, because their coverage has been so shameful, not just in the documentary space, but in the news space, the online space, the ridiculous headlines. There was a study by the Center for Media Monitoring recently, which said they give 33 times as much coverage per Israeli casualty as they do per Palestinian casualty. So there's not a perception of partiality. There's a well-documented evidence of partiality towards Israel.
And I want to linger on that point and connect it to the point that you made about the original controversy that then put this documentary on ice. Trying to imagine a world in which a documentary was made about the difficulties faced by Israeli children in the war, which are non-trivial, often headed to bomb shelters, which is absolutely, even if nothing happens, it's traumatizing for a child to have to hide somewhere with their family in the dark, worried that they might get hit by a bomb. Like, that alone is traumatizing. So let's say that the BBC commissioned a documentary, focused on the way that the war was affecting children, and then it turned out that the boy's father worked for the Ministry of Agriculture in Israel, and they pulled the documentary and apologized and investigated.
Never would happen.
And investigated how that could happen. How could you possibly have aired the thoughts of a child whose father works for the Ministry of Agriculture in Israel? That, to me, kind of tells you everything you need to know about the way that the BBC approached this. So how difficult was it to kind of pry this out of the BBC, or were they like, thank you, Mehdi, like, we're so glad to be done with this controversy?
So the heavy lifting was done by Ben DePere at Basement Films, who made this film, sweat and blood in this film, spent a long time in back and forths with the BBC. And, he runs an independent production company. It's very risky for him to pick a fight with one of the biggest broadcasters in the world, which commissions his stuff. So props to my friend Ben, really, for believing in this film and saying, look, I want it out there. Doesn't matter if I screw up my relationship with people. Doesn't matter if I lose money on this. I want it out there. And the BBC did sit on it for a while and weren't going to release it, as far as I'm aware. And eventually they did release it, partly because of Ben's cajoling, partly because I think they just wanted to be done with it. And then us and Channel 4 were able to come in and say, well, we're going to give it a platform. I knew from the moment they benched it, like, if this film becomes available, I was messaging Ben saying, we want a platform. This is what Zeteo was created for, right? To give these voices to the world, to try and platform these voices. We know, Ryan, you and I, that the right have been arguing about cancel culture for decades, and yet the single biggest victims of cancel culture are Palestinians and supporters of the Palestinian movement and journalism about Palestine and academia about Palestine. And that has been a fundamental issue. We've seen that in this conflict. And I think that was a frustrating issue where the BBC we're not airing it and we're not releasing it. And the moment they released it, we moved fast, and props to Channel 4, broadcaster in the UK for running it. Because again, Ryan, you say Hamas and everything shuts down. All critical faculty shut down, even amongst smart, liberal, progressive folks. And if you're able to say anything's Hamas, then that's what you're able to throw at it. And I'm sure people will throw that at this film as well. One thing I took great pride in doing was take, the BBC put out a statement saying, this is not our film anymore. That's true. It's not their film anymore. We made a few changes. One of the changes we made is we took out all references to the Hamas-run health ministry. We call it the Gaza Ministry of Health in this film. That in itself is a propagandistic and loaded phrase, as you well know, because it allows people to then cast doubt on the deaths and torture of Palestinians. And we have eyewitness accounts of this film from people who have nothing to do with Hamas about that suffering. Just one quick story that your viewers might be interested in that I heard recently from someone else. You talk about kind of imagine if this was the other way around. A production company, I'm told, went to a major American broadcaster at the start of this conflict, at the start of the genocide, and had a story about a Palestinian family just kind of followed them around and the suffering they were going through and the number of members of the family who had been killed. And the American broadcaster said, we'll run it, but first let us go and find an Israeli family so we can balance it, and we'll run both stories. A few weeks later, they came back to the production company and said, well, we can't find an Israeli family that suffered like the Palestinian family you showed us. Therefore, we're not running your story. Not we'll just run yours, but we won't run anything now because we can't do this fake bullshit balance.
Right, and it would have looked worse if you tried to do the balance, because you'd see
So they just dropped the whole thing.
Right.
This is what happens. Palestinian